Hello viewers, today I will be speaking on negative freedom. But before going on negative freedom, let us know what actually freedom means. Freedom and liberty, these are very common terms which are used interchangeably. But liberty is regarded as the distinctive principle of liberalism and freedom is acclaimed as a universal principle. Freedom is considered by liberals, idealists as well as Marxist theory. Nobody quarrels with freedom as an end, but different schools of thought differ on the means and mode of realizing freedom. That means no matter which school of thought champions freedom or liberty, they all agree on one common thing, that is they all cherish freedom as an end goal, but they differ on the means and mode of realizing it. Even those who are champions of absolutism, dictatorship or despotism, they pay lip service to freedom, though for them freedom is submission to authority, which represents highest form of excellence. So freedom overall is cherished by all individuals and all streams of thought. What is freedom in general parlance? The term liberty has been derived from the Latin word liber, which means free from all shackles. That means liberty means absence of all restraints or restriction, that is freedom to do whatever one pleases to do. F.A. Hayek, in his book Constitution of Liberty, he has used the term interchangeably liberty and freedom. He argued, according to him, a man possesses liberty or freedom when he is not subject to coercion by arbitrary will of another person. That means when a person is free to act or do what he pleases without any external restraint or restriction, that is freedom actually. Now, why there has been so much, what is the importance of liberty, or we have seen since historical times to the present day modern world that there have been so many struggles for freedom, and all these liberation movements or struggles have been ultimately inspired by the demand for more and more freedom, because freedom is the distinctive quality of man. It is man as distinguished from other living beings who demand freedom, and he evolves institutions and civilization to secure and guarantee it. It is a force behind social change. It is the voice of the oppressed. It is the voice against injustice. It is the voice to re-establish human values as against the rules of animal kingdom, because the privileged class always want to maintain the status quo. They do not want to share the freedom on a universal principle. Therefore, we see that there have been so many revolutionary struggles. Peasants have stood in revolt against the landlords, or the colonies have stood against their colonial rules to demand freedom or liberty. Scope of freedom. This actually describes the boundaries of freedom and authority. The problem of liberty involves the adjustment of claims between individual and society. The state comes into the picture because it is the instrument or agency for regulating their relations. Now, what is the scope of the freedom, or where the freedom ends and the authority starts? The problem of liberty involves the adjustment of claims between the individual and the society or the state. If the claim of the individual is stretched to an extreme in utter disregard of the interest of the society, liberty would be reduced to license. Therefore, if an individual is allowed to do whatever he wants to do without any control, in utter disregard or in complete disregard of the society or the community, it will not be called as liberty, but it will be called as license. On the other hand, if the liberty of the individual is increasingly restricted and controlled in the supposed interest of the society, then it will also not be liberty or freedom in the true sense, but it would be an unconditional submission to authority, hence the loss of liberty. Therefore, it is very important to distinguish between liberty and license on the one hand, and to fix the proper frontier between liberty and authority. As I have already told you that the struggle for liberty has started long back, and in modern time, we can trace it to the 17th century Europe in the wake of Industrial Revolution, with an emphasis on negative liberty, particularly in the economic sphere. We all know that after the Industrial Revolution, the mercantile industrial class, they have desperately demanded for negative liberty, that is freedom from the interference of the state in economic activities. It was intended to pave the way for the establishment of capitalism against the prevailing force of feudalism. They believed that man is a rational being and he is the best judge of his own interest, and man should be left free in the economic sphere. There should be freedom of trade, freedom of enterprise, freedom of contract, and the market forces should determine the price of the commodity, and each individual, if allowed to operate without the control of the state, he will bring out the best and it will increase the efficiency and productivity in the economic sphere. So, these kind of demands of freedom from the state, especially after Industrial Revolution, led to the foundation or establishment of capitalism. The main political axiom of negative liberty was based on this, that everyone or every individual knows his own interests best and that the state should not decide his ends and purposes. The champions of negative liberty did not believe in individual choice of resources and techniques, but also on the parties or the choice of the parties to deal with in their transaction. Thus, freedom of contract was considered as a sacrosanct and was regarded as an essential requirement of liberty. From this only we have heard the word laissez-faire, which is a French word which means leave me alone. That is, the champions or the new middle class, industrialist class, they espouse the cause for laissez-faire, that is, leave individuals alone in the economic sphere. From the 17th century Europe, this demand for negative freedom started. So, it was put forward by the new middle class against the mercantile policies of the state, and their ultimate demand was freedom of trade, freedom of enterprise, freedom of contract, and a free competition of the market forces of supply and demand. That is, market should decide the economic production, the supply and the demand, and the state has no role to play. It should just be a night watchman, that is, perform law and order duties. This is another second important component of negative freedom, that state was viewed as a negative state, because as I have already told you, liberty is decided by the relations between the state and the individual. So, in the economic sphere, they demanded that the individual should be left free to operate his economic activities and should be guided by the market principles, and the state has a very limited, or I should say a negative role, that is, it should just regulate, that there should not be any hindrance in the economic activities and should just perform the function of law and order. The state was viewed as a negative state, that is, I'll again repeat this word, negative state, that is a necessary evil. State was considered a necessary evil, that means necessary for law and order, and evil because if it performs any function beyond that, it is a threat to individual liberty. So, it has just to be a police state, not anything beyond that. So, it was required not to interfere with their natural liberty of man, but only to maintain their liberty by protecting their person and property from the onslaught of other individuals. And this concept played a very important role, and this concept of negative liberty, that is, state as a negative state or as a necessary evil, and the concept of laissez-faire, that is, let me alone in or leave me alone in economic sphere, proved instrumental in the establishment of capitalist system in Europe. It released the forces of production which were so long blocked by the feudal system inherited from the Middle Ages. Now, who were the champions of the laissez-faire, or I should say exponents of negative freedom, who raised this demand first? So, this idea of negative liberty, which led to the doctrine of laissez-faire, that is freedom from government interference in economic sphere, was put forward by a very famous economist, Adam Smith, in his book Wealth of Nations, Jeremy Bentham, James Mill, Henry Sidgwick and Herbert Spencer. These all are the popular leading champions or advocates of negative liberty. I'll repeat the names: Adam Smith, Jeremy Bentham, James Mill, Henry Sidgwick and Herbert Spencer. They all are classical and neoclassical economists who are also negative liberty theorists. I would like to refer about Atlantic Charter, which was a declaration of 4 freedoms drawn up during the Second World War to indicate the war aims. But now, even after the end of the war, they indicated the public policy or the aim of the state in bettering the life of individuals. The 4 freedoms were freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from fear and freedom from want. We can classify all these 4 freedoms on the basis of some common features. The first 2 freedoms, such as freedom of speech and freedom of worship, they symbolize the negative aspect of liberty. That is, they imply or demand a negative role of the state in enjoying the liberty to speak, and that the state should allow an individual to follow his conscience and practice religion of his own. So, these 2 type of freedom broadly explain in short what does negative freedom means. That is, the role of the state is just not to interfere in the lives or activities of an individual, whereas the other 2 freedom, such as freedom from fear and freedom from want, they symbolizes the positive aspect of liberty, which call for a active and positive role of the state in guaranteeing these freedoms so that an individual can exercise the freedom. Without the role of the state, an individual cannot be free from fear or can be free from want. Now, in the next part of this negative freedom, I will talk about the contributions of major exponents of negative freedom. The first in this line is Adam Smith, a very famous economist. He was a Scotsman and he is regarded as the father of science of economics. His famous work was Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of the Nations, or we popularly call as Wealth of Nations. In this book, he clearly stated the aim of the government, which is just to conform to the nature and let men pursue their economic activities without any interference of the state. So long as men do not interfere with each other, liberty, and do not combine among themselves in order to encroach upon the liberty of others, government should leave them free to find their own salvation. That is, the government should not interfere in the activities of law abiding and economic pursuit individuals. Criminals, madmen and monopolists should be eliminated. Other than that, the state does not have any role, because according to him, man is guided by the natural instinct of profit and everyone has a natural propensity to trade, for which he even used the term economic man. The selfish motive of the man or the enterprise is no doubt conducive to the overall prosperity of the country, because it will harmonize individual growth with national prosperity, thereby benefiting all government, business and labor. Another famous negative liberal was Herbert Spencer, who in his book The Man versus the State and the Principles of Ethics very clearly applied the principle of natural science to social organization. Herbert Spencer's famous principle, the struggle for existence and survival of the fittest, is a guiding principle of social evaluation. In this process, he says that the state has a very limited role to play and it is just function of protection, administration of the law of equal freedom. The state is not entitled to perform any other function. According to him, if the state applies the principle of family ethics to the state, then what will happen? It will actually give incentive to the undeserving candidates or undeserving individual, because it will protect the undeserving. So, therefore, he believes that the state should go to the extreme of eliminating the weak who cannot survive in this era of competition. So, the principle of struggle for existence and survival of the fittest clearly speaks out the broad policy or the broad aims of the state, which is just to leave individuals compete freely, and the weaker will automatically perish, and it will contribute in the collective community welfare. Another important exponent of negative liberalism in this line is Jeremy Bentham. He is also called as the founder of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism stands for the revival of the classical hedonism of Epicurus. Now, what is this classical hedonism? This principle regard man as a highly rational creature who is always guided by the hedonistic calculus. And what is this calculus? That is, a man always want to maximize his pleasure and minimize his pain. This implies that man's behavior is always governed by these two considerations, and he should be left free because he knows his interest very well. This theory was adopted by the Bentham to the countries of 18th and 19th century Europe to prove its relevance. Bentham of course treated the state as an instrument devised by the man for promotion of happiness of community, but he did not encouraged or contemplated any wide scope of state activity other than legislation, which could, even the legislation only he gave state a very important function, but a very limited, that is legislation, and that too on the condition if it could help in removing a person's pain and maximizing his pleasure. James Mill is again another big English scholar who defended negative liberty in his book on liberty published in 1859. J.S. Mill very clearly or explicitly brought out that the sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number is self-protection. The only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. His own good, either physical or moral, is not a sufficient warrant. So, according to him, the state should only come to the rescue of individual when it threatens his life or liberty. Other than that, the state has no role to perform. This book on liberty of J.S. Mill constitutes a very persuasive and convincing defense of the principle of individual liberty ever written. He even used the term self-regarding action, that is, those actions of an individual which does not affect any other person or does not harm the interest of any other person should not be encroached or interfered upon by the state. Hobbes was another famous English social contractualist who presented his case of liberty in his book Leviathan. According to him, a free man is he that in those things which he by his strength and he is able to do is not hindered to do what he has a will to. According to him, even the laws of the sovereign framed after civil society, which has been created by the social contract or a contract which was entered upon by the free individuals, is a hindrance in his freedom. For him, he said it in one line that liberty is silence of law. The more logical distinction between negative and positive liberty is one that focuses on the role of state under different situations. So, this entire discussion about negative and positive freedom revolves around the role of the state. That is, negative liberty consists in the absence of restraint, that is non-interference by the state in certain activities of the individual to enable him to pursue his happiness so long as he does not obstruct others in their similar freedom to pursue their happiness. I have already mentioned two examples, freedom of speech and freedom of conscience. In the exercise or enjoyment of these two liberty, you do not want a role or an active role of the state, you just want that the state should not interfere. Whereas in the positive freedom, to enjoy certain kinds of freedom, that is freedom from freedom from ignorance or freedom from poverty, you want an active or a positive role of the state. So, negative liberty focuses on the role of the state whereby it does not interfere. Two dimensions of liberty. One is freedom as absence of external constraint, which come under negative freedom, and second is freedom as an expansion of opportunities to express oneself, which come under positive freedom. If I sum up negative liberty, it is first feature which comes is that it consider individual area of action as inviolable. That is, it sees individual as an alienated, atomized aggregate, whereby which should not be encroached upon. That area of individual is very sacrosanct and it should not be encroached upon by the state. So, it is like it is very individualistic in nature. Second, it does not allow any external authority to interfere, and individual has the right to do whatever one likes. Third, it debates on the area of interference, because it wants that the area of interference should be as minimum as possible, whereas positive freedom calls for maximum role of the state, negative freedom calls for the minimum area of non-interference. It is concerned with explaining the idea of freedom from, that is freedom from absence of restraint. Individual is a core of negative liberty. Freedom has been described as negative in two different senses. In the first, law is seen as the main obstacle to freedom, that is, freedom is limited only by what others deliberately prevent us from doing. Now, negative liberty, we find that after for some time negative liberty was challenged and the theory of welfare state came into being. But again we are seeing in 20th century that there was a brief time in after Second World War that again negative liberty was questioned and it was modified in the form of welfare state, which balanced both freedom and the role of the state. But now during the second half of the 20th century, we are seeing that the theory of welfare state, which was a reformed version of negative liberty or freedom, was again considered as inimical to individual liberty, and again the tradition of negative liberty or freedom has been revived. Their thought is an important component of contemporary liberal theory, and it is a very important aspect of modern day time, which we call as rollback of the welfare state, or again revival of negative freedom by using the term libertarianism. It is described as libertarianism in order to indicate the renewed concern with liberty and to distinguish it from the recent changes in the liberal outlook. What actually libertarianism, or we can call as the revival of the negative freedom in the contemporary times after we have seen the benefits of the welfare state, is that libertarianism upholds full autonomy and freedom of the individual. Like we are seeing again, we are going towards privatization, liberalization. So many vital or the key institutions of the government are again geared towards privatization, because now we again believe that negative freedom is a stifle economic growth, or it is not conducive to prosperity and is not guided by profit motive. So, libertarianism believes that full autonomy and freedom should be given to the individual, and he should be liberated from all institutions which tend to restrict his vision of the world, including the institution of religion, family and customs, of social conformity apart from political institution. And the chief exponents of libertarianism in the modern day times are F.A. Hayek, Isai Berlin, Milton Friedman and Robert Nozick. Among them, Isai Berlin, a very famous negative liberal theorist, he gave a very new and a distinctive turn to freedom. He distinguished negative freedom and positive freedom as that negative freedom is something that the state can only secure to the individual by ensuring that he is not prevented from choosing his course of action. On the other hand, positive liberty also according to him does not belong to the realm of state action, but it is something which belongs to individual's own will and capacity, which is beyond the scope of the state. So far, whatever distinction I have made between negative freedom and positive freedom are determined by the relation of individual and state, but here Berlin said that even the positive freedom for him is something which is beyond the scope of the state, because for him Negative freedom is that is ensuring an individual or allowing him to do whatever he wants, and positive freedom also means that he is the master of himself. And Berlin has taken the position that the availability or non-availability of means is entirely an individual's own concern. If a person cannot fly like a whale, cannot fly like an eagle or swim like a whale, it is his problem. According to him, it depends upon him only. Or if a person is too poor to afford a loaf of bread or to take recourse to law courts, it is something for which Berlin blames an individual only, that it is all entirely dependent upon his capacity, that he is not able to afford those means whereby he can enjoy the freedom. So, he is not giving any role to the state. State has no responsibility according to Berlin to make the required means available. So, the more logical distinction between negative liberty and positive liberty is the one that focuses on the role of the state under different situations. Another libertarian was Friedman. Milton Friedman, in his Capitalism and Freedom book, he identified capitalism or competitive market society as a necessary condition of freedom, which implies repudiation of equality for the sake of maintaining freedom. According to him, in order to maximize the freedom, the government should handle only those matters which cannot be handled through the market at all, or can be handled only at so great a cost that the use of political channels may be preferable. And this we are seeing in the present day times also, that the key and the vital industries like defense, communication, railways are handled by the state, and those areas whereby the market forces can be allowed to run and direct are taken over by the private individual. Robert Nozick, in his Anarchy, State and Utopia, he said that the state has no legitimate powers beyond the function of protection, justice and defense. It is not authorized to engage in redistributive transfer among the citizens who were originally its client. Hence, he ruled out the concept of the welfare state. Nozick holds that acquisition or transfer of property without force or fraud is just. It is not necessarily he is entitled to hold property either by virtue of just acquisition or by receiving property from someone who has just handled him. So, legal rights are therefore the product of voluntary exchange, and the state has no right, an individual has freedom of contract. Negative liberty or freedom has been stretched to extreme by anarchists, who says, for example, William Godwin, a well known anarchist, he opines that law is an institution of the most pernicious type. Anarchists maintain that more powerful the state, more curtailed and confined will the individual liberty be. Hence, anarchists have gone to an extreme whereby they want to abolish the state. So, in this way, I can conclude, or I can sum up my negative freedom in two aspects. One and the foremost is laissez-faire, that is principle of leaving an individual free in economic activities, assigning the state a negative role, that is state is a necessary evil and the state should perform only those functions which are required for maintenance of law and order and should be a regulator. It should not be a promoter. However, there have been certain pitfalls in this theory, which Herbert Spencer summed up, that the state exists because crime exists in society, otherwise there will be no need of a state. So, negative view does not adequately take into account that poverty, lack of land, capital and political power are grave obstacles to realization of powers, and for removal of all these obstacles and to ensure and to let individual enjoy his freedom, the state should play a positive role, and these obstacles have to be removed by law for attaining the common good. Thank you.